Let's bring in MS Now's David Noriega live from Minneapolis. MS Now senior White House reporter Laura Barone-Lopez at the White House, and also with us former ICE director under President Obama, Sarah Saldana. David, what else did we learn from this press conference about the future of Minnesota ICE operations?
Well, Anna, the biggest point is what you just heard Tom Homan say there, which essentially boils down to Homan suggesting that the federal government might scale back Operation Metro Surge in exchange for Minnesota and local jurisdictions therein to draw back on their sanctuary policies and cooperate with the federal government more in terms of, handing over undocumented people in their custody. I've covered the debate over sanctuary policies for many years, since before the first Trump administration, and I think it's important to remind our viewers that the reason a lot of these policies exist and the reason immigrant communities have advocated them for a long time is because a lot of people in county jails are not people convicted of serious crimes. They're often people picked up for low-level offenses who haven't been convicted of anything at all. People who've lived here for a long time, people who have families, and that is why sanctuary policies were pursued for a very long time. Now, I have been in touch with some people who are in the immigrant rights community here locally in Minnesota, and they haven't. We're still waiting for their formal statements on this, but the sentiment, Anna, is that they see this as coercive. They see this as essentially the federal government putting its boot on the neck of the Minnesota people and saying that it'll only take it off if they compromise on some of their fundamental principles. And they say that they're going to urge Governor Walz not to negotiate with Tom Homan or the federal government, that the conditions of the negotiation are unacceptable given the violence we've seen on the streets of Minneapolis in the last few weeks. Last thing, Anna, real quick. We can't forget the immigrants in question, the people who live here, the people who have been, bearing the brunt of these operations for a long time. And I just want to play you a little bit of an interview with someone that I met last night, a young woman whose father was detained last week. They haven't been able to find him. He's not showing up in the ICE detainee locator system online. They don't know where he is. They can't contact him. It is one of many stories like this. Listen to a little bit of what she told me about what this situation has done to her family.
It feels like a nightmare that you haven't woken up from, because you feel helpless. It feels like as much as you try to find answers, the more you try, it feels like the more the system fails you. Or the more you feel like, the more you try, the harder you try, you don't get much done, or you don't get much answers to anything. And it feels, personally for me, it's felt like I have had a piece of my heart torn in pieces.
And of course, I should say the reason we concealed her identity is because she is afraid of retaliation from the federal government, both directed at her father, who is in their custody, or potentially at her and other members of her family who are living here in Minneapolis, Anna.
And to not be able to figure out where her father is, that has to be just so devastating and weigh so heavy on them. Thank you for bringing us that story and the latest from the ground in Minneapolis, David Noriega. Laura, Homan coming out like this, it was very notable how his tone was very different from what we've seen from other administration officials on Minneapolis specifically. How's the White House strategy changing? Do we expect to see tactics change as well?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Anna, because even though Tom Homan, the border czar, is saying that the mission is the same, that the administration is simply going to be, quote, smarter about operations, the sources that I've talked to who are in ICE, in DHS, and outside of DHS, who are former ICE officials as well, have told me that there appears to be no guidance, no official memo, no official word from the president or from Homan or from others to ICE agents, to CBP agents, saying that the tactics need to change, or saying that this is going to be a totally different operation. And the fact is that even if a drawdown does occur in Minneapolis, there is still an expansive operation in cities across the country that ICE and DHS is carrying out in order to meet those quotas. The big question is, are the arrest quotas going to change at all? And so far, there's no indication that they will. And as you know, Anna, Stephen Miller is a big architect of this deportation operation. And right now, despite a change in tone about what is happening in Minneapolis, there is little evidence so far that tactics or quotas or the larger mission are going to change. And as a part of that mission, there are collateral arrests. And Tom Homan said that today, saying that if there are undocumented immigrants around, when they are going to target who they say are alleged criminal undocumented immigrants, then they will get swept up in that. And we've also seen where refugees have been detained and arrested and kept in Texas, and American citizens have been arrested and detained. And so right now, I think we just have to caution with whether or not the tactics are actually going to change, Anna.
Director Saldana, from what you've seen from ICE, their tactics on the streets, the deaths of 2 American citizens at the hands of federal agents, DHS now investigating itself, not welcoming independent investigations. Where does its credibility stand?
Well, that's a great question, and I am just so dismayed by the fact that these negotiations between the governor, the mayor, and DHS officials is happening at this very sensitive time. They do need to happen. Something needs to move here in the right direction. But as you said, officials, agents on the ground, the removal officers on the ground have certainly lost credibility. They have been diminished in a way that you could not have planned this more so if your objective was to diminish the entire credibility of an agency, and for that matter, a department, the Department of Homeland Security. You have a roadmap here for what's happened in the last few weeks in Minneapolis. It is very discouraging for us who agree with Tom Homan, who served as the head of my enforcement and removal operations. He's very familiar with targeted removal operations, which we did under the Obama administration. So Tom knows how to go about this business. Why this wasn't followed from the beginning, why there's not this tendency to get the community on board rather than to try to just run over the community in effecting the mission. The mission is important. I will not sit here and say that ICE should be abolished. That is not it doesn't really make that much sense. Change the name if you want, but it is the policy and the manner of enforcement that is the real problem right now.
Make that case, though, for people who are skeptical that ICE still has a role in this country after everything we've seen in these clashes and the way Americans and migrants, people who in some cases have legal authority to be here or legal protections to be here, have been treated.
Well, I am going to make the case for the mission, and the mission is statutory. You're going to have to get Congress to change the authorities that ICE has in the law. And no one has wanted to get anywhere near comprehensive immigration reform, which is really what's essential. But for the moment, we definitely need de-escalation, and it's so important that steps be taken. The mission under the Obama administration was determined specifically by priorities. Your reporter mentioned there's no memo. We had a memo in October of 2014 that laid out the priorities. And in fact, of the 500,000 persons who were removed through interior removal operations under my watch, almost over 90% of them had criminal convictions. So Tom Homan knows how to do this. Quite frankly, the agents on the ground know how to do this. What you had before was a mishmash of officers and law enforcement officers. I even saw one with a jacket that said Bureau of Prisons. What is a Bureau of Prisons officer doing on the street in situations that can be highly charged, and particularly the way that ICE came in like gangbusters at that moment?
Yeah, there are